The manuscript we're looking at here illustrates another way that books were produced in the medieval period. This is a copy of the book of Isaiah, one of the books of the Old Testament. Now, it was very uncommon in medieval times for complete copies of the Bible to be written, and there were several reasons for this. Firstly, the economics involved. So number of skins you would need, animal skins you would need to make the vellum or parchment to write a complete Bible would run into the high hundreds, if not thousands. For example, we know that in one medieval text, the Book of Kells, where they've done an analysis of the number of skins that were used to make it, there were 613 animals used to make the Book of Kells, and that's only the 4 Gospels. So to write a complete medieval Bible was a large economic undertaking. So it was much more common to have groupings of books which people were familiar with or which were highly important. So you often got the 4 Gospels as a group. So you have the Book of Kells, which is the 4 Gospels, or the Lindisfarne Gospels, and later on the Golden Gospels of Ectonach and so on. Or you would have the Revelations, another commonly written text, and they're now known as apocalypses because they're predicting the end of the world and so on. But individual books of the Bible were also produced. So you could have a complete Bible, but it might be in 27 or 30 volumes, depending on how many sections were written. But complete Bibles, as I said, were rare. And where they do occur, they're called pandects, which means a complete treatise. The oldest known pandects that survives is the Codex Amiatinus, which is now the personal Bible of the Pope. And it was written in Wearmouth Jarrow in England in the late 8th century, early 8th, late 7th century probably, and taken to Italy by an abbot called Jolfrid, who died on the way, and then the Bible was lost for about 1400 years and ended up in Monte Cassino and then in the Amiatina Library in Florence, hence it's named the Codex Amiatinus, even though it's an English Bible. But that's getting away from what we think. The other reason why complete copies of the Bible were rare is it was rare to have just the text of the Bible written by itself. The medieval system of thought was that you relied on previous sources and interpretations of texts and so on. And it was quite common to include what's called glosses. Now, a gloss can be a number of things. A gloss can be an explanation of an individual word, such as you have here, and in which case this explanation would either be written above or below the word you're discussing or in the margin, and you would have an indicator what you were talking about by there being a capital letter included or a small Greek letter or even underlining. Now, these small letters or underlinings are called lemma, which means the solving of a problem, an explanation, if you like. And we still use the word lemma in part in the English word today, dilemma, which means you failed to solve the problem. But by about the 13th century or early 14th, when this text was written, there were 2 major glosses which would always be included in any explanation of the Bible. And this is why you get this complex layout of the page that you have here. Now, these 2 glosses were called the Glossa Ordinaria, or the common gloss, because it was commonly used, and the Glossa Interlinearis. Now, the most important was the common gloss, the Glossa Ordinaria, and this is the one you see around the outside of the Bible text here. The actual text of the Bible is these large, heavily inked words which you see on the page. It's this large black letter script. The Glossa Ordinaria occurs around the outside and over the top, and in between you have the Glossa Interlinearis. Now, the Glossa Ordinaria, as we know it, was written by a man called Walafrid Strabo, who died in 893. He was a German scholar, and he aimed to use the early church fathers and other guidance to produce what was a literal commentary on what the Bible meant. And this commentary remained in use well into the 17th century, and it's quoted by such eminent late medieval scholars as Thomas Aquinas and others. It was still in common use. Walafrid Strabo's other name is Walafrid the Squinter. We don't know whether this was because he went blind from all his writing or he was born with an eye fault to start with, but it was probably a comment the fact that his eyesight had deteriorated over a number of years, peering at biblical texts and writing them out. So Walafrid the Squinter of Fulda was his full name. Now, the Glossa Interlinearis, which is the one you see here, is an explanation of the flow of the text, and it was written in Spain sometime in the 9th or 10th century. And it's less important than the Glossa Ordinaria. But you can see that it leads to this complex layout of the Bible. So a book like this one, the Book of Isaiah, which we commonly see in a copy of the Bible today, takes about 20 or 30 pages. In this one, it takes nearly 120 leaves because of the conclusion of the commentary around it. And depending on how important the part of the text is, the things will change. So every page has a different layout depending on how much text they originally wrote on it and how much commentary they have. Now, to write out a straight text of the Bible, the book of Isaiah, might take you about 3 or 4 months if you were very careful and just writing out slowly. To work out the layout of each page as you go along means it would take whatever X factor as you go along. So it would take several years to write out a book like this. Now this one is early 14th century. The script tells us it was written somewhere in France, but there's no indication in the text whereabouts it was written. This type of script is called a French lettre bâtarde or a French Gothic. And it's getting to the stage where it's becoming increasingly difficult to read because of the contractions and things in it. And you can see here where someone has made corrections to the text where there's been an obvious mistake by the scribe in writing it out. It's also a very good example of how the page was ruled up. You can see the remains of the lines, which are the guidelines to the scribe here, the starting point of which is this series of minute holes down the outside of the page here. Some early studies of manuscript thought these were remains of sewing, where it had been sewn into another book and then taken out. But what we now know is that they're called the prickings, and it was how you ruled up your page. You would either use a pair of compasses or a spiked wheel, which you would run down the side of the page and give yourself this straight, even set of lines. If you do this on both sides, you can then rule across and get a straight line, and the same way down the top and bottom of the page. The prickings on the inner margin, you can just see that they still remain in the margin down here, but the ones on the top and bottom have been cut out when the book has been rebound at some stage in its career. And we can tell it's been rebound because the bottom margin doesn't match the top. Originally the text would have been centred in the middle of the page. And similarly the inner margin doesn't match the outer, which would be much more common. But as you see when you look at it, every page is different in the way it's laid out, depending on how much commentary there is with it, the amount of pen work and flourishing that's gone into it. And it does contain some gold and silver, which makes it a true illuminated manuscript. The historiated capital we have here, historiated means it contains a picture containing a human being of some kind. Here we have the martyrdom of St. Peter the Martyr, who was being martyred by having his head cut open with a saw. The other gold capital is simply decorated floral capital with burnished 22-carat gold. And the gold would be laid down by laying it over a base of egg white and then polished with a dog's tooth, burnish it. So all in all, it's a reasonably complex manuscript in its layout. What it shows is why complete copies of the Bible were rare in medieval times. You simply couldn't write the complete text of the Bible and all the commentaries within it in one large volume. It was just simply too large to contemplate. Sometimes they would the commentary would be separate. You could have a text and then you'd have the commentary after it. That meant you had to interleave backwards and forwards if you wanted the explanation while you were reading it. So it was much more common to have the commentary survive this way or the gloss survive this way. And today it still continues in some forms of books we use, like law books and books of religious, books of theology where there's a large amount of explanation given. So the habit hasn't died out.